I stole, borrowed permanently, a good portion of this environmental science lecture from an online source. I don't even remember where I got it from, years ago. And I've augmented it over the years to tie in the idea of the Lorax. And so we're going to talk a little bit about environmental science. I see this really as the culminating portion of this class. If you recall, my original definition is the study of the earth and how humans interact with it. And so environmental science is very much a part of geography because it deals with how we humans interact and how we have changed our thoughts about the earth and what we're doing to kind of preserve it. And so there's a great Iroquois phrase that says, in every deliberation or every choice, every decision we make, we must consider our impact for the next 7 generations. And if you shop at Target, I don't know if they have it anywhere else, I just know they have it at Target. They have that entire like branch of products called 7 generations. And so their whole idea is that their product doesn't create damage for 7 generations. And so it's really clean and very earth friendly and stuff like that. So every time I walk in there, I think of this quote from the Iroquois Confederacy. All right, so we start by looking at Yosemite National Park. And so this park was created in 1890, sorry. And we start by taking a look at where it's situated. It is part of your map test, so study. So Yosemite National Park is located here, and directly west of it is San Francisco. So in 1890, we made this national park, and in the 1906, there was a massive earthquake in San Francisco. And so shortly after Yosemite Park was created, the city of San Francisco had this huge population boom. There were tons of people moving in there due to the gold rush, and they had this ginormous earthquake. And the biggest devastation actually was not really the earthquake itself. Yes, it shook the buildings. Yes, we needed to go back and redo our infrastructure and make our brick buildings, you know, better for earthquakes. But the bigger problem was that, well, the water. The city caught on fire, and they weren't able to pump enough water up the hills, and the water pipes were so damaged that this fire just completely just obliterated. The fire hydrants weren't working, and so a lot of the damage from the earthquake was, you know, a byproduct of the earthquake, but more importantly, this fire. And even after that, there was limited water supply for the people living there, and so they looked east. They looked to a place just inside or just outside of Yosemite National Park called Hedgehedge Valley. So what does this have to do with what we're going to talk about today? Well, let's just see. So environmental science is the study of the interactions of humans with the natural environment, which kind of makes sense. And the environment includes all of those living organisms and that surrounds us, from the plants and the climate and the, you know, the landforms and the soil and all that stuff. So it's all of these things that surround us. And so we've talked all about these things already. And so a community decides, what was I thinking? I don't remember. Oh, so sorry. little scatterbrain this morning. I don't know what it is. It's the lion in me. A community decides to use coal. So environmental science is a complex issue. It's interdisciplinary. It brings all of these things together. So it brings the soil scientists and the forestry people and the engineers and the ecologists and nature and people and culture, because of course some cultures look at the environment differently than others. And so what do we mean by that? Well, it includes all of these concepts. So if we look at, for example, we decide to, use coal for our electricity because it's the cheapest source available. So that deals with economics. And the coal has to be mined from the soil. So that's going to be your geologist who's going to figure out where to get that. And then it's got to be transported to the population. So that's going to require some engineers to build the roads. And it's then turned into a power plant. And so we need some chemists to figure that out. And then it falls, as the rain is created downwind from where this plant is, because we're releasing a lot of carbon dioxide and other byproducts of burning coal into the atmosphere. And so that deals with meteorology. And then the acid stresses the plants and animals, and that of course is ecology. And then the laws are passed to, regulate all this stuff. And so that deals with politics. So environmental science is this interdisciplinary thing that impacts everything, kind of like geography. Why isn't it going forward? So let's look at the history of environmentalism. So we start by looking at, why isn't my cursor working? I'm sorry. So humans have impacted the earth since the beginning of our civilization. And so we start here in the Fertile Crescent, which is the Tigris and Euphrates, and over in the Middle Eastern portion. And in 2400 BC, the agricultural fields of what was then called Sumeria had grain production similar to modern agriculture at about 30 bushels per acre. And the Sumerians, the people who lived in the Fertile Crescent, relied on irrigation, or the artificial application of water from somewhere else. So they weren't dry land farmers. They, took the water and they brought it to places that didn't typically have water. So this is what the Tigris River looks like, and you can see all of the vegetation in this region. So that, of course, contains small amounts of salts, and that salt built up in the soil over time. And so, the yields declined. They weren't as productive as they were. And so by the 7th century AD, they had to pay slaves to essentially strip the salt layer from the soil so it can continue to be farmed. And this, of course, is played out in other places also. So I think of the Dust Bowl right here in the United States, where we over farmed the land, and then the land didn't have anything to hold the soil down, and so it all blew away essentially. So so this example of the Fertile Crescent and the mention of the Dust Bowl is two important concepts in environmental science. The law of unintended consequences, which states that the actions of people, and especially governments, has unexpected effects. So nobody knew that by, overproducing or, trying to, that the salts would be deposited and be left behind, and that now that has caused problems further down the road. And the other one is the idea of unsustainability, that the conditions, what we're doing, cannot be done at the same rate, or we're going to, it's just not viable. So, something ultimately happens, which brings us to the idea of the tragedy of the commons. So an ecologist wrote an essay called The Tragedy of the Commons, describing a major source of environmental conflict. And so I am going to show you this cute little TED video that talks about the tragedy of the commons. Hopefully hear the video. Can you hear the video? Thank you.
Imagine as a thought experiment that you live in a small village and depend on the local fish pond for food. You share the pond with 3 other villagers. The pond starts off with a dozen fish, and the fish reproduce. For every 2 fish, there will be 1 baby added each night. So, in order to maximize your supply of food, how many fish should you catch each day? Take a moment to think about it. Assume baby fish grow to full size immediately, and that the pond begins at full capacity, and ignore factors like the sex of the fish you catch. The answer? 1. And it's not just you. The best way to maximize every villager's food supply is for each fisherman to take just 1 fish each day. Here's how the math works. If each villager takes 1 fish, there will be 8 fish left overnight. Each pair of fish produces 1 baby, and the next day the pond will be fully restocked with 12 fish. If anyone takes more than 1, the number of reproductive pairs drops, and the population won't be able to bounce back. Eventually, the fish in the lake will be gone, leaving all 4 villagers to starve. This fish pond is just one example of a classic problem called the tragedy of the commons. The phenomenon was first described in a pamphlet by economist William Forster Lloyd in 1833 in a discussion of the overgrazing of cattle on village common areas. More than 100 years later, ecologist Garrett Hardin revived the concept to describe what happens when many individuals all share a limited resource, like grazing land, fishing areas, living space, even clean air. Hardin argued that these situations pit short-term self-interest against the common good, and they end badly for everyone, resulting in overgrazing, overfishing, overpopulation, pollution, and other social and environmental problems. The key feature of a tragedy of the commons is that it provides an opportunity for an individual to benefit him or herself while spreading out any negative effects across the larger population. To see what that means, let's revisit our fish pond. Each individual fisherman is motivated to take as many fish as he can for himself. Meanwhile, any decline in fish reproduction is shared by the entire village. Anxious to avoid losing out to his neighbors, a fisherman will conclude that it's in his best interest to take an extra fish, or 2, or 3. Unfortunately, this is the same conclusion reached by the other fishermen, and that's the tragedy. Optimizing for the self in the short term isn't optimal for anyone in the long term. That's a simplified example, but the tragedy of the commons plays out in the more complex systems of real life too. The overuse of antibiotics has led to short-term gains in livestock production and in treating common illnesses. But it's also resulted in the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which threaten the entire population. A coal-fired power plant produces cheap electricity for its customers and profits for its owners. These local benefits are helpful in the short term. But pollution from mining and burning coal is spread across the entire atmosphere and sticks around for thousands of years. There are other examples too. Littering, water shortages, deforestation, traffic jams, even the purchase of bottled water. But human civilization has proven it's capable of doing something remarkable. We form social contracts, we make communal agreements, we elect governments, and we pass laws. All this to save our collective selves from our own individual impulses. It isn't easy, and we certainly don't get it right nearly all of the time. But humans, at our best, have shown that we can solve these problems, and we can continue to do so if we remember Hardin's lesson. When the tragedy of the commons applies, what's good for all of us is good for each of us. TED-Ed is a nonprofit. If you value our work, please consider supporting it on patreon.com/TEDEd.
All right. So the tragedy of the commons deals with the idea that our self-interests can cause bigger consequences than if we all just thought about this as we're in it together. And so we look at the idea of, okay, let's say there's two villages and they're both raising sheep. And the first village has a common pasture with unrestricted access. You can throw as many sheep on there as you want. The second village, what they've done is they've divided each section. So each owner of the sheep can only, put as many sheep in that area. So which village is more likely to experience resource depletion? Where the resource is going to be consumed faster than they can be replaced in a place where we're all sharing one common area, or where each person is responsible for their little plot. And the idea is, of course, that, is that if we have a common area, then everyone's going to put as many sheep in order to, maximize their profits. They're going to be like, well, I'll just throw another sheep over there. But what ultimately ends up happening is you get too many sheep to graze per acre. And so it's called, as we go, and it's the idea of the tragedy of the commons, that there's going to be resource depletion when we do not consider the whole, we just consider what's best for us, kind of thing. So this is a major environmental problem, the idea of resource depletion. And so a great deal of resources are needed to support our human population. We're now actually just under 8 billion people. And so this brings up the idea of renewable resources, which of course can be replenished within a human lifetime. So those are things like timber and water, and non-renewable resources are replenished so slowly, or if at all, and these can be used up. So like oil and minerals and coal and all that good stuff. So those are non-renewable. Once we, use up all of the, I always call them dead dinosaurs, but they're really the plants and the dinosaurs, but mostly the plants. Then there's nothing left. That's it. We've got to come up with something else. So renewable source. So over time, it becomes more difficult and expensive to extract. And our coal reserves, of course, are declining. So, and on top of that, not only is the amount of coal declining, but the quality of it is declining. So, so this is from 2008, but it estimates we have about another 250 years of resources remaining at the current rate of use. That's if we continue to use at the same rate, which isn't really what's going on, unfortunately. With the increase in population, we're having an increased demand for coal production. Other environmental problems, and we've talked about a lot of these: pollution, which is the degradation of an area, water, land, soil, the ocean, all that stuff. Yes, there are things that are biodegradable that break down naturally over time, but then there are the non-degradable things like plastics. And so we look at, this is air quality. So another environmental issue is pollution. And whether that be in the land or the water, it can also be in the air. And it doesn't always impact the area right next to it. And so the problem of pollution can actually be far away from the source. Kind of like the Pacific garbage patch is, in the middle between us and Hawaii. So who's it really impacting? We can't really see it, but it's the stuff that's being washed off of our shore that's ending up there, or boats and things like that. So other environmental problems, of course, are the loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity isn't just the number of species, but it's the number of different species. We don't really know how many species there are on Earth, but there's estimated to be tens of millions. And so it's not just, as I said, sorry, the number of species, it's the diversity, how many different types of critters there are, not just, oh, but it's great. We've got like, 5 billion panda bears, but that's all we have, like that's not biodiversity. That's just a lot of species. So another idea which you should be familiar with is extinction, which is of course the complete loss of a species. And that can be, due to a natural event like an asteroid colliding with the planet, or it can be accelerated, of course, by humans. I don't know if I talked about the wolves in Yellowstone, but we hunted the wolves because wolves are bad. They, eat the sheep of the people who were grazing their land nearby, and nothing like seeing a wolf take down a cute little deer or something in a national park, right? You get this national park, you're inviting all these people, and then you've got little Timmy out there, and he's watching the cute little deer, and then out comes this pack of wolves, and they like take down the poor deer. So that's bad, right? So sometimes it can accelerate things. There are 5 known major like extinction events in the Earth's history. The most recent one was about 65 million years ago. It caused 75% of all the species to disappear from the Earth. That was the death of the dinosaurs. It was believed to have been caused by a meteor impact. So assuming that there are no catastrophic events occurring, extinction normally occurs at a pretty slow rate. It's called a background rate. It's about 1 mammal for every 200 years. And just scientists and major environmentalists believe that we are in the midst of the next major extinction event due to human influences. We've lost tons of critters. I'm sure you could name some of them: the dodo bird, the Arctic fox, things like that are declining rapidly or are gone completely. And so we're losing lots of critters at a background rate that is much faster. So I'll show you, alone has lost 27 different mammal extinctions since the 1780s due to the influence of European settlers. And so we're now going to watch the Lorax. There are some questions that are in that little packet. So it is available on YouTube, but I'm going to show it to you on Hulu because the quality is a little better, and I might as well, use what I've got, right? When one has Hulu, one should use Hulu. That's what I say. So give me a second here. This is not the new one. This is the old one from the 70s. So no, you don't want to do that, but you're gonna do it anyways. Go.
At the far end of town where the grickle grass grows, and the wind smells slow and sour when it blows, and no birds ever sing excepting old crows, is the street of the lifted lorax. Grickle grass, grickle grass, street of the lifted lorax. Grickle grass, grickle grass, somebody lifted the lorax away.
What was the lorax? And why was it there? And why was it lifted and taken somewhere from the far end of town where the grickle grass grows? The old onceler still lives here. Ask him. He knows. You won't see the onceler. Don't knock at his door. He lurks in his lurkim on top of his store. And on grickly midnights in August, he peeks out of the shutters, and sometimes he speaks and tells how the lorax was lifted away.
It all started way back, such a long, long time back. Way back in the days when the grass was still green, and the pond was still wet, and the clouds were still clean, and the song of the swami swans rang out in space. One morning I came to this glorious place. Then I saw the trees, the truffula trees, the bright-colored tufts of the truffula trees, mile after mile in the fresh morning breeze. And under the trees, I saw brown barbaloots frisking about in their barbaloot suits.
Under the trees, happy dappy barbaloots. Under the trees, in our barbaloot suits. Under the trees, eating truffula fruits. Holy succulent, mellifluous, deliciously, mellifluous,
Sweetly succulifluous
truffula fruits. Summertime's a comin', under the trees. Hummin' fish a hummin', under the trees. Under the trees.
Oh, these glorious
Splendibulous, splendorious, splendibulous.
dandy flandy flimbulous truffula trees.
Those trees, those truffula trees. All my life I'd been searching for trees such as these. The touch of their tufts was much softer than silk, and they had the sweet smell of fresh butterfly milk. I felt a great leaping of love in my heart. I knew just what I'd do. I unloaded my cart. In no time at all, I had built a small shop. Then I chopped down a truffula tree with one chop. What you doing in my tree stump, buddy?
Your tree stump? Your tree stump? Mister, I am the lorax. I speak for the...
Forget it. I don't really need the stump. You can have it, little fellow. Huh? Just enough to finish the cuffs. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Now, who'd you say you were, little fella?
Mister, I am the lorax. I speak for the trees. I speak for the trees have no tongues. And I'm asking you, sir, at the top of my lungs, that horrible thing that I see. What's that thing you made out of my truffula tree?
Look, Lorax, calm down. There's no cause for alarm. I chopped down just one tree. I'm doing no harm. This thing is most useful. This thing is a need, a fine something that all people need. It's a shirt. It's a sock. It's a glove. It's a hat. But it has other uses. Yes, far beyond that. You can use it for carpets, for pillows, for sheets, or curtains, or covers for bicycle seats.
Sir, you're crazy. You're crazy with greed. Well, there's no one on earth who would buy that fool's need.
worth of an industry, you poor stupid guy. You telling me what the public will buy?
Please, I object in the name of the trees.
All complaints will be filed in this box, if you please.
All right, so you get the idea. Let me resume my sharing back to my, oops, I pushed the wrong button. Doing such a good job. Okay, so of course you can continue watching it. The idea is, of course, if you're not familiar with the Lorax, the Onceler just starts chopping down all the trees, and then he realizes that he can, if he maximizes and gets these giant machines, and then there's air pollution, and then everything pretty much has to like either die or leave. And so so the Lorax is a good example. It was made in 1972, or into a TV special like you saw. The book was written in 1971, and so just keep those dates in the back of your mind as we continue to talk about what's going on. So it's a good example of the tragedy of the commons, and it's a great example of the law of unintended consequences, which is the idea again that we do something and we don't think about what the impact will be down the line. And so, oops, I said go forward. Okay, so the idea of environmentalism actually started back in the progressive era, and it was the first big environmental movement. It began with the conservation measures of Teddy Roosevelt to stop lumberjacks from chopping down all of the redwood trees. So the goal was to prevent resource depletion and the destruction of the commons through unsustainable logging and hunting. And so this is when we started creating national parks and state parks, and really kind of started to set aside areas that could be preserved for future generations. So, and there are varying levels of preservation. So the national parks are the most restrictive. They basically need to remain unaltered from their original state. So that means no fishing, no logging, no hunting, no livestock grazing, none of that. But not all of the parks are like that. We have national forests, which surround Southern California pretty much. So these are federally managed. They allow you to go hunting and fishing, but you can't log the trees. That's the fact that it's a forest. So the idea is to keep the forest. Then we have wildlife refuges, that don't allow for commercial activities, but they allow for recreational hunting and fishing. And you're like, but it's a wildlife refuge. Like, how can you be hunting and fishing, but not? So they're restricted. So a lot of times, for example, the wildlife refuge may protect a particular species, and then they of course want to eliminate anything that might threaten that species. So you're allowed to do hunting and fishing. So if the idea is to preserve, I don't know, the salmon, then maybe you can kill bears there because we're trying to preserve the salmon and the bears eat the salmon. So it just kind of depends. So you'll notice if we look at a map of all of the wildlands, all the preserved common area, most of it's in the west. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, it was the area that wasn't developed or as developed during the progressive era. So there was a lot more available land in the west. And additionally, there's of course a greater diversity of species and things like that, but mostly because it wasn't as developed when it started back in the progressive era. So let's see here. So the focus of resource conservationists, of course, is to preserve that open land. So the national parks and the national forest system were both created during this progressive period. and they were mostly concerned with resource depletion, and they categorized natural resources into 4 things. Renewable, we've already talked about. So inexhaustible things like sunlight, and renewable things like timber and soil, they can be replaced, but it takes time. Non-renewable, that's the coal and the oil and the gas and stuff like that. And then recyclable, renewable resources. They're not replaced at the rate they're used, but they can be used more than once. For example, iron and aluminum and copper and things like that. So those are the 4 things that we came up with during the progressive era about resource depletion. So the next concept that is important is what we call environmental ethics. So this is the discipline that studies the relationship of human beings to the environment. So what is the value of the environment? What responsibility do we have to deal with the problems of the environment? What needs should be given to the highest priority? And there are 2 main categories of ethics that have emerged during modern history. There is the anthropocentric view, which is human-centered. These set of ethics protect and promote human interests and the well-being at the expense of everything else. So often this, of course, is going to be that short-term benefit with disregarding long-term consequences. So we are the top of the food chain idea, and we can do whatever we want as long as humans are best served by it. So that's one view. The other one is called an ecocentric view. This is the idea that nature deserves to exist for nature's sake, regardless of how useful it is to humans. So, you know, even if we have, you know, the lowly spider, it deserves to live just as much as you deserve to live, essentially. So regardless of if we can do anything with that spider or that snake or whatever, ecocentrists believe that it's alive, therefore it deserves to be able to exist. So let's go back and talk about the Hedgehedge Debate. So there was that fire and that earthquake in San Francisco. It's near a national park, and San Francisco said, hey, look, there's this great, you know, water supply that's not too far away. And so they said, if we just dug a tunnel, you know, a water aqueduct from Hedgehedge to San Francisco, we could solve all of our freshwater problems. And they're like, that sounds like a great idea. And so what they did is, of course, it would have had to been signed by Congress because it was just inside the park. But it was in an area that wasn't really as accessible as if you've ever been to Yosemite. You know, there's the really, you know, the valley part where everybody hangs out, where all the national park stuff is. Then there's like the Tuolumne Grove over on the east side, up in the high Sierras. But the interesting thing about Hedgehedge is, if you know about John Muir, he actually described Hedgehedge as being the thing to preserve over Yosemite Valley, meaning he felt it had a lot more intrinsic value than the Yosemite Valley itself. And so the people-centered people, the anthropocentrists, argued that San Francisco needed the water, and this was the best, most viable option. The ecocentrists said, hello, it's in a national park. It kind of goes against everything we agreed a national park was about, which is to leave an area untouched by human hands. And unfortunately, well, this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. So, yep, this whole area, including the Native Americans that lived in Hedgehedge Valley, were covered in water. And so they built a dam, and they the water just naturally accumulates there behind the dam, and then they just pump the water from here to San Francisco so that they can have a nice water supply. So the justification was best stated by a guy named Gifford Pinochet. He was the first man in charge of the Forest Service. He basically said, when there's conflicting interests, the answer should always be what's going to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the long run. And so he was definitely an anthropocentrist because nobody thought about, okay, yeah, but down the road, what are we doing about, so so that brings us to the modern environmentalist movement, because that was back in the turn of the century. So we had the progressive era, we had the creation of all these national parks and national forests and stuff, and then we violated that essentially and said, well, but San Francisco needs water, and that's where all the people are, so it's the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And throughout time, we never really had any environmentalism. Really, we had the anthropocentrists and the ecocentrists, and there wasn't really, they would clash every once in a while, but ultimately what led to the modern environmentalist movement was a variety of concerns, not only about resource conservation, but pollution and things of that nature. So the birth of modern environmentalism occurred in the 20th century, the late 20th century. And the first one was in 1935. There were these things called cane toads. They were introduced into Australia to help control a beetle, which was destroying the sugarcane crop in Australia. The problem is that, well, as you can see, all of the little cane toads on the road, there was nothing really to eat these cane toads and keep their population down. So they became what we know as an invasive species. So they overpopulated. They were able to outcompete the native species. So yes, they didn't have a beetle problem. What they had now was a cane toad problem, right? And this is particularly of interest in lots of island countries. I remember in the 80s, I went to Hawaii with my parents, and they were talking about they had a snake problem in Hawaii. So they had like snakes all over the place, and they were trying to get people to visit Hawaii because that's where they get a lot of their money. And everybody was complaining about the snakes. So they invited over a mongoose, because mongoose eat snakes, and then they had a mongoose problem, and then they invited over some sort of cat, and then they had that cat problem. So it's like, you're just, sure, we've now gotten rid of this one problem, but now we've created a whole nother problem, right? So sometimes we don't really think down the road. Another environmental issue was in the 1940s, a dense smog from a zinc plant in Pennsylvania got lots and lots of people sick. So it was one of the deadliest incidents of air pollution. We hadn't really thought about, we're burning all this coal, we're, creating all of these, metals and things like that. We didn't really think about what impact that's going to have on the environment. Another one, of course, is, the 3 Mile Island situation. So radioactive fallout from a nuclear bomb test in the Marshall Islands. Nobody really thought about, and they were just testing, but it exposed lots of people to radioactive fallout. The material, of course, is carcinogenic, which means it increased your risk of cancer. So, and they did this not just once or twice, but pretty much from 1946 until 1958. They just kept blowing stuff up out there in the Marshall Islands. But one of the more interesting ones, of course, is DDT. So DDT is a pesticide. It's a really good pesticide. It kills, lots of pests. I remember growing up in the they were still using it. Oh, now they used malathion, which you can still find, like DDT in some pesticides, but they've really kind of changed which formulations they use and stuff like that. But in 1962, a gal by the name of Rachel Carson made a book called Silent Spring, and it documented the effects that spraying of pesticides like DDT had on the environment. And yes, that is somebody just standing there being sprayed by DDT. We didn't realize that in addition to killing pests, it can also, cause other problems. The crazy thing about DDT is that it doesn't go away. And what I mean by that is it's not water soluble. And so it lasts for a very, very, very long time. In fact, there was just an article just a few months ago about some barrels of DDT that were released off the coast of California. So there was a big DDT creation plant near like Palos Verdes or Malibu. I can't remember. It couldn't have been Malibu. It must have been Ranch, like Palos Verdes near the peninsula. And when they stopped making DDT because we realized, oh, that's really bad, the plant shut down. And what happened was they realized that DDT it's a persistent chemical. It doesn't break down. It's kind of like plastic, only in a chemical format. So a lot of pesticides and stuff like that, if you spray them down, it kind of breaks the molecules apart, except for DDT doesn't work like that, which is why it's really good at killing insects. Because it sticks around a long time, which means the insects then, come in contact with it again, even though you haven't sprayed it in a while. Anyways, they threw all of these barrels off the coast of California, and they paid to clean it up once they got caught, of course, right? Because that's what we do. We, do things and then ask for forgiveness rather than permission, because it's easier that way, right? I mean, but and so they were seeing high levels of DDT in the water up near Santa Barbara. And that's how they were able to figure out, hey, this plant did something bad. So then they charged the plant, and the plant said, okay, we'll pay to clean it up. Well, in 2021, I don't know, about a month or so ago, I'm like reading through the LA Times, and they have been using some like sonar, and they found barrels, huge 55-gallon drums dropped in a line as if they were pushed off of a boat just off the coast of Catalina. So between us and Catalina, there's like all these barrels of DDT. And in order to make them sink, because it's hard to fill a barrel and eliminate all of the air, they poked holes in them and then dropped them in the ocean. And now of course, they're rotting. And that, like I said, the DDT didn't go anywhere. So really high levels of DDT just off the California coast. So it may not have been the fact that they were caught shoving the things off the Palos Verdes coast. Instead, it could be the stuff that is now washing up there. Because so anyways, a good article in the LA Times, and I'll share this PowerPoint with you if you want to see it. But if you just Google DDT LA Times, I'm sure you'd find it. And so Rachel Carson was like the Aaron Brockovich of the 1950s. If you're familiar with Aaron Brockovich, hopefully you are. If you're not, you need to do some Googling. And so many species, such as the whooping crane, nearly disappeared or completely from the wild due to overhunting. And oh, this is a little video on the Silent Spring, but I'm trying to get done, and I have quite a bit to go. So this little whooping crane guy really kind of raised our awareness of the problem of extinction, which again is where species decline or disappear from the earth. And so we already talked about the background rate. It's between 1 and 5 species per year. And if you look at the percentage of species, this is where the background rate should be. So from the 1800s to 1900s is where the peak started happening. We started losing lots and lots and lots of species. Okay. So in 1978, homes in the Love Canal of New York were abandoned due to leaking from a waste dump near an elementary school. And these are especially dangerous to the environment and human health, which brought us to our like when we think of environmentalism, we think of the EPA and the Safe Drinking Act. So let's look at some of these things happen. So Safe Drinking Act, 1974, Clean Water Act, 1972, Clean Air Act, 1970, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, 1976, Endangered Species Act, 1973. The EPA was made in the 1970s. Remember, once again, the Lorax, 1970. The video, 1972. And so we have all of these things that we started going, okay, we need to start holding our people accountable for this pollution that we're causing on our planet. And many of these issues, of course, persist today, but are increasingly complex because it's not just us in the US that are having the problem. We now impact, places all across the planet. And so one of the things they showed in the first video I showed you on the tragedy of the commons was the hairspray thing, the depletion of the ozone layer. That required everybody to kind of get together and go, hey, we've got a problem. And the only way to solve it is if we all agree to stop using chlorofluorocarbons as propellant. So what does that mean? We had to figure out another way to get the Aquanet, which was the biggest hairspray. I used it constantly. There was only one way to get your Liberty spikes to stick up back in the 70s and 80s was with the Aquanet hairspray. It worked really, really well. But yeah, it also killed off the ozone layer. And so but we all had to agree, we had to reduce the amount in our air conditioning refrigerants and things like that. And so there are a lot of indicators. I have a plant outside my window. I call it the indicator plant. When it starts turning brown, I realize that the sprinklers aren't working because that thing is in the shade all the time. So if that is turning brown, there's something really wrong. And we have other environmental indicators that we look at. We go, there's a huge drop in biodiversity in this area. Maybe something's going on. Climate change is a good indicator that something has changed, right? Human population growth, the depletion of resources. But the more crazy idea is that there is a divide, a demographic divide. It's the haves and the have-nots. It's the polluters and the people who are impacted by the pollution. And so this is looking at the difference between developed countries, which tend to be wealthier, have higher rates of education, advanced infrastructure, and a better overall standard of living, versus a developing country, which is essentially they have typically inadequate infrastructure, a lower standard of living, less education, they tend to be poorer, and things like that. And so there are significant differences between the two. The gross domestic product, which is how much goods and services they produce, of course, in high developed countries versus lower developed countries. Fertility rate, typically your less developed or developing countries are going to have higher fertility rates. They're going to have more children because they're typically not going to live to adulthood. Life expectancy is significantly different between the two. In the higher or the developed countries, you're going to have higher, you're going to live longer, versus the lower, the developing countries. Environmental regulations. So if you look at, a developing country like China, they don't have a lot of environmental regulations. They also don't have any bees. They've killed off all of the bees in China, which is kind of interesting because a lot of plants require bees to kind of go in and pollinate them. And so what do? They pay people to go and artificially, pretend that they're bees with little cotton swabs inside plants. It's really kind of weird to get their fruit trees, because the only way you get fruit is with a bee going in and moving the pollen from one plant to the other. So let's see here. Yeah. All right, so then we get into the idea of what is an ecological footprint, which is the measurement of how many resources we use. And this shows are really interesting. This is back in 2001. I'm sure it has not changed significantly since. I should actually update this particular slide. I'm sure there's a new one out there. But you can see that North America, of course, has the largest ecological footprint, and that deals with, you know, how much we consume. So it includes, you know, the amount of space we need in order to support, you know, our living. So our forests, our farms, our cities. And of course, we have much larger footprints because we use a lot more resources. We use a lot more coal, we use a lot more oil, we use a lot more, you know, space, you know, things like that. And this right here is the available biocapacity per person. That's how much space is actually on the planet. So the goal is to be at or below this so that we're not depleting our resources. Developed countries, while they can be smaller in size, consume resources at a greater rate. About 20% of the population uses 75% of the resources of the planet, which is kind of crazy. So if you look at, for example, our growth rate and our life expectancy, we're expected to live to about 77. If you go to Indonesia, they're at 68. Gross domestic product per person, about $30,000 US versus $640 if you're in Indonesia. How much energy we use, how much carbon dioxide we produce, how much garbage we make, things like that. So there's also the idea that we tend, because these developing countries need money, we and the developed world tend to take advantage of the situation. So we will pay them to store our waste or deal with heavy metal situations and things like that. But an interesting story is the Bhopal, India in 1984. The plant was built in 1969 to create a pesticide at a reduced cost. Why? Because they had cheaper labor, fewer environmental regulations, less expensive process to create. And so the demand for this particular pesticide that they were making decreased in the 1980s because the supply increased. So if you remember, economics is, you know, demand and supply and the curves. And so what happened is that this intermediate chemical was started being stored in tanks, and those tanks, of course, were too full. There wasn't enough room, and the plant started leaking the toxic chemical into the atmosphere, and thousands of people died, and hundreds of thousands of people and animals were sick, and the hospitals were overwhelmed, and the government passed a law that allowed the Indian government to represent the entire affected population of Bhopal. And a settlement for $470 million was reached by Union Carbide, which is an American company. And well, the settlement, of course, was not sufficient to treat all of the long-term health issues stemming from the disaster. The site wasn't actually cleaned up. They just gave them money. They just said, okay, well, here's the problem. Let me fork you over some cash for your loss, right? But they didn't actually get rid of the chemical. It was still there, still leaking into the atmosphere. In the 90s, in the late 90s, Union Carbide was purchased by Dow Chemical. Dow still exists, Union Carbide's gone. And to properly compensate and treat all the individuals, Dow Chemical would have to pay billions, with a B, of dollars in settlements. And although Dow Chemical has a profit over 2 billion and total assets of about 70 million, they didn't quite really do that. And so this is, oh, is this the full movie? I think I only want to watch a portion of this. There are these guys, they're called the Yes Men. They have all these videos online. And some people got kind of creative about solving some of the problem. So let's see what the yes men did to try and save the world.
International finance. Some of the biggest banks in the world would be there. These were the kind of banks who helped companies like Union Carbide and Dow do what they do.
Let's go back.
Can afford for the Chamber of Commerce to cave.
Event.
Legislation.
A hoax email. So we've got a group known for perpetrating stunts. And here we have our vaunted and respected state-controlled media falling for it without even checking it out. The internet is just a sewer. It seems to me they get most of their news from that sewer these days.
We're here with this special file sharing edition of
The Yes Men Fix the World.
Yeah, and this is a special edition because we have another film to show you first, one that you won't see anywhere else because we're being sued by the United States Chamber of Commerce.
And as part of their lawsuit, they have demanded that every copy of this video that you're about to see be impounded and destroyed.
So, please do pass it around.
September 2009.
Back in September, we were working with a bunch of climate change activists to plan an event in Washington, D.C. We wanted to make a political point about an organization that's pulling off some of the world's biggest hoaxes. No, not this organization. The one across the street. The one that looks like a U.S. government office, but really is working against the government. In reality, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is a large corporation that is reported to lie to the public on behalf of even bigger corporations. They spend nearly $500,000 a day trying to convince the U.S. government to do really stupid shit, like killing environmental regulations and undermining workers' rights. But since they spend so much money on their hoaxes, many people believe them. And as it says, American free enterprise dream big, but their dreams are our nightmares because their plans are to prevent us from passing climate change legislation, which means we're screwed. Since the chamber was hoaxing us all and threatening our survival, we decided to fight fire with fire. We would reveal one of their biggest lies by masquerading as them. We would hold a press conference as the Chamber at the National Press Club, but first, we sent out a parody press release from them. It was sort of like their normal ones, except ours was sane. How would the world react to the Chamber suddenly reversing its position on climate change?
Bit of reversal on climate change from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It will reverse its position on the climate change bill and wants a carbon tax, if you will. All right, so the U.S. Chamber's denying it now. All right, so maybe not. Apparently it was a hoax. Either there is a group or some people or a person.
Is there any involvement of the White House whatsoever?
I couldn't even begin to go there, Larry, on that one.
Today, the country's largest business lobby, the Chamber of Commerce, got punked. It began early this morning when a press release went out, purportedly from the United States Chamber of Commerce. Amazingly, the release said that the Chamber would now support this legislation that it's spent months fighting against. Reporters were surprised and probably confused at this odd turn of events, but that was nothing compared to what actually happened at the press conference when it was held later on this morning. Watch this tape.
Clean coal is a technology that has not only not been proven, it basically doesn't exist.
Okay, this is, I'm Eric Wolfschlegel. I'm with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. This is not an official U.S. Chamber of Commerce event. So I don't know what pretenses you're here. I know some of you in the press world, but this is a fraudulent press activity and a stunt.
Who are you really, sir?
Now that we had our...
What happened? Oh. No, wait, this is...
Now that we had our new friends at ease.
All right, let's see here. This isn't working. Okay. How do I open this? Hold on. There we go. That's what I want to do. I want to watch it on the YouTube.
It was time to ask them the really tough questions.
Oh, that's right.
What would you say to people who harp on other tragedies?
Oh, whoa. Now I've got like 3 episodes of it. Okay. So what these guys do is they impersonate organizations in a very sneaky fashion. And so let me show you what they did about the Bhopal thing. Let's see here. This. Yes. Okay. Play go.
It was time to ask them the really tough questions.
What would you say to people who harp on the Bhopal catastrophe or other tragedies?
Bhopal is an interesting example, but that facility had created educational opportunities for an Indian emerging technocratic class. It had created value added and tax base for the community, and something like 3,000 people died. That's a tragedy, but there are always risks of going into the future.
There are always risks of going into the future? For thousands of people in Bhopal, there was no future. At least the Jonestown suicide cult killed only themselves. The free marketeers seemed willing to put everyone else at risk. Back at home,
you have new mail.
We had mail. Turned out our Dow site was the gift that kept on giving. This time, it wasn't a mere conference. We'd hit the jackpot. The BBC, perhaps the world's most respected news organization, was doing a big broadcast about Bhopal, and they wanted to know whether Dow might finally clean up their mess. The interview, they said, would be broadcast to 300 million people. This was what we'd been waiting for. To the BBC's great surprise, Dow emailed back to say they would be delighted to speak publicly about the catastrophe. As for us, 300 million people was about 1 million times bigger than any other audience we'd ever had. We were scared. So we asked the BBC if instead of coming to their headquarters in London, we could meet them in neutral territory, the original land of revolution.
Are you a little nervous? I'm so nervous. Oh God, it's like going to the guillotine. I think it's right near where they used to have the guillotine too in Paris. The office. Yeah, I think it's the biggest thing we've ever done. This. I haven't combed my hair in like 20 years, yeah, really. Like, I think I used to do it this way. Alright. Oh, God.
Oh, God. When we acquired Union Carbide 3 years ago, we knew what we were getting, and today we are prepared to do the obvious.
Let's see. Don't film too much when we get there, I think. Bonjour.
And you're watching BBC World, our main headlines. The world's worst industrial accident is being remembered in India today. It's 20 years since deadly gas leaked from the Union Carbide chemical plant in the city of Bhopal. At least 18,000 deaths are attributed to the leak, and many local people say the contamination has never been properly cleared up.
Yeah. Should I typically just look right into the camera? Okay.
The factory still exists here, and that's been a real problem for the people living here locally. I mean, the site, I've been to it, and it's full of toxic waste. People who are living in these houses, they've all got a story to tell about that day 20 years ago. Many of them lost members of their family, and they say that they're continuing to suffer because of the tragedy. And they're saying somebody needs to answer for this. Legally, what they're saying is that they want to pursue the company to try and clean up the site, but whether the company will accept liability seems doubtful.
Well, joining us live from Paris now is Jude Finisterra. He's a spokesman for Dow Chemicals, which took over Union Carbide. Good morning to you. A day of commemoration in Bhopal. Do you now accept responsibility for what happened?
Steve, yes. Today is a great day for all of us at Dow, and I think for millions of people around the world as well. It's 20 years since the disaster, and today I'm very, very happy to announce that for the first time Dow is accepting full responsibility for the Bhopal catastrophe. We have a $12 billion plan to finally, at long last, fully compensate the victims, including the 120,000 who may need medical care for their entire lives, and to fully and swiftly remediate the Bhopal plant site. Now, when we acquired Union Carbide 3 years ago, we knew what we were getting, and it's worth $12 billion. $12 billion. We have resolved to liquidate Union Carbide, this nightmare for the world and this headache for Dow, and use the $12 billion to adequately compensate the victims.
Jude, that's good news that you have finally accepted responsibility. Some people would say too late. It's 3 years,
Yes.
almost 4 years on.
When we acquired Union Carbide, we did settle their liabilities in the United States immediately. And we are now, 3 years later, prepared to do the same in India. We should have done it 3 years ago. We are doing it now. And I would also like to say that this is no small matter, Steve. This is the first time in history that a publicly owned company of anything near the size of Dow has performed an action which is significantly against its bottom line simply because it's the right thing to do. And our shareholders may take a bit of a hit, Steve, but I think that if they're anything like me, they will be ecstatic to be part of such a historic occasion of doing right by those that we've wronged.
Just to reiterate what Jude Finisterra, the spokesman for Dow Chemicals, has just said, he says Dow Chemicals now fully accept responsibility for the events in Bhopal.
Great. That's it?
Well done.
Great. Now they wanted
Now you do
radio. I can tell you one thing. We're not going out of business. We will continue to make profit. We will simply make slightly less profit than normal. But we are doing the right thing. We're comparing here, though, the value of money to the value of human life, and there is no comparison.
It's a good thing to announce. For once,
Exactly. I mean, how often does Dow get to, you know? It wouldn't be, I wouldn't want to be a Dow spokesperson otherwise. Good. Oh my God. Oh my God. I'm gonna have a serious nervous breakdown now.
Dow accepts responsibility for Bhopal, spokesman. Where is that? In Reuters.
Congratulations, your appearance. Everyone here at BBC cheered. It's over now and it's still headline news. Hello, this is Jude. Who has said that? Perhaps they're not in communication with the Dow leadership. Hello? Yes, this is Jude Finisterra. Sure. Right. Sure. Right. Let me just, yes, could I ask you to hold for a moment? They know. So now, I guess, I just basically come clean, right? Well, I wouldn't say it's a hoax. It's an honest representation of what Dow should be doing.
This morning, a false statement was carried by BBC World regarding responsibility for the Bhopal tragedy. The individual who made this statement identified himself as a Dow spokesperson named Jude Finisterra. Dow confirms that there was no basis whatsoever for this report.
Well, earlier today, we carried an interview with someone purporting to be from Dow Chemical, a company which subsequently bought the plant from Union Carbide. This interview was inaccurate and part of an elaborate deception.
Take a look at this, Dow. Like, look at this. This is the top of Google News. Dow said on Friday there was no basis whatsoever in a BBC World Report saying it had accepted responsibility for India's Bhopal disaster. That's a funny sentence.
The hoax was an elaborate one involving a fake website. Dow Chemicals was quick to issue a series of statements denying all knowledge of Jude Finisterra.
Also tonight, backtracking because of this man.
We're going back to the BBC television studio right now that we were at this morning because they want to talk to us. Thought, well, okay, what do they want to know? Well, let's go see.
So your real name is Andy, right?
Yeah.
When
Hello.
did I?
Sorry.
When did it occur to you to pull this off?
It didn't occur to us at all. We got contacted by you guys.
You also have the Dow's share price.
Yeah, I did hear that. Has it
2.5%
gone back up? Or?
Well, the prank, which briefly knocked 3% off Dow shares, comes 20 years to the day after the chemical leak from the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal.
Today's unlikely corporate humiliation of a US chemical giant was all about reminding the world that Bhopal remains an unhealed sore.
Well, earlier I spoke to Andy Bickelbaum and I asked him what he did when he got an email from the BBC asking him for an interview.
Essentially, Dow has been promulgating a hoax by which they've convinced people that they can't do anything about Bhopal, that they cannot accept responsibility. And we wanted to prove that that was not accurate.
I mean, it is nevertheless a pretty cruel trick to play on the people of Bhopal.
Well,
did you think about the people of Bhopal when you decided to peddle this stunt?
Yes, we did. And
well, that surely is the tragedy of today. You spring upon them the actual hoax that they actually suddenly believe that they have got a payout from Dow, and then, you know, an hour or two later they find it's untrue.
Let's put this in contrast. I mean, we may have given two people 2 hours of false hope. Dow has given them 20 years of suffering. I mean,
are you
this is what we're faced
expecting
with.
the next knock at the door to be Dow's lawyer?
No idea what Dow will do.
Dow's lawyers didn't call, and millions of people learned for the first time that 20 years on, Bhopal was never cleaned up.
All right, so those are just two small portions of two very long videos put together by these two guys who are trying to take on environmental things and get public awareness. And so the goal, of course, is to create a sustainable world in which the human needs are met so that the population afterwards, so that we can survive indefinitely, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability to meet the needs of the future. And so there's a lot of different things that go into that, recycling and managing and stewarding the planet for our future. And so the ecocentric worldview that emphasizes sustainability for all species is kind of what I want to make us all aware of, and that we should preserve nature as much as possible, because in doing so, we're actually preserving ourselves. And so it takes us back to the beginning, to this moonrise picture, or earthrise picture, sorry. The Earth is a closed system. Nothing enters or leaves the Earth in large quantities except for heat. Space aliens maybe, but we're not aware of it completely yet. So our resources are limited, but we keep increasing our population. Waste isn't going anywhere. And so we really are kind of vulnerable to pollution and other things. And so we need to take better care and really be environmental stewards, because we're all on this together. All right, so that is my really long version. Okay, I hope you all learned something, gained some insight.